Hello, my name is Dr. Karen Kossie-Chernyshev. I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of SWATH 2021, Absolute Equality, Pursuing the Promise. Yesterday, we had 2 outstanding presentations by Dr. Brian Franklin and Dr. Collette Bloom. The panel was moderated by Dr. Ramona Houston. And today, we have an equally engaging set of presentations. Dr. Merline Pitre, Professor of History of Texas at Texas Southern University, and also Professor Tomiko Meeks, and their conversation, or their presentations and the post-conversation after the presentations are given will be guided by Nelva Williamson. Before we get going, I do want to just let you know that I am the founding director of SWATH, and I'm delighted to have both Nelva and Tomiko working with me this year on this year's presentation. I want to give a greeting from our provost, Dr. Lillian Potes. Thank you, Dr. Potes. So we're now going to move toward our presentations today, Absolute Equality, Pursuing the Promise. We'll have discussions about Texas Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 3, both of which have to do with voter suppression. And so I'm gonna yield the floor to Nelva Williamson, and she can introduce our speakers.
Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce our 2 speakers for today. Dr. Kossie, you want me to introduce both at the same time?
You can. I think
okay. All right. And I'm pardon me for looking down, but these ladies have such a rich resume that I do not want to miss anything or leave anything out. Dr. Merline Pitre is a professor of history at Texas Southern University, having received her doctorate and her MA from Temple University. She is currently, as I said, a professor of history, but has also been dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Behavioral Studies, an associate dean at Texas Southern, as well as an associate professor. Dr. Pitre is a prolific author who has written several articles and books in her field of expertise, most notably on the life of Lulu B. White, a civil rights activist from Houston. It was through Dr. Pitre's work concerning Miss White that Miss White was added to the 7th grade curriculum, and I had the honor to teach my 7th grade students last year about the wonderful work of Lulu B. White. Thank you, Dr. Pitre, for adding her to our list, a real shero. Dr. Pitre has been a keynote speaker on several occasions, and she has received many awards for her outstanding scholarship in the fields of U.S. Reconstruction and social and political history. Additionally, her special recognitions and memberships concern her book, Born to Serve, which was the winner of the Summer Lee Foundation Book Prize Award in 2019. And also, Born to Serve was the winner of the Otis Locke Award for the best book in East Texas history. Dr. Pitre was inducted into the History Makers Organization in 2016, and also is a winner of the Presidential Achievement Medal Award in 2014. Because of her outstanding contributions in the field of Texas history, in 2009, Dr. Pitre became a Texas Fellow. Although that is an abbreviated portion of her resume, you can see just how prolific and rich her involvement in Texas history has been. It is my honor to present Dr. Pitre. Additionally, I would like to introduce to you all Tomiko Meeks. Tomiko Meeks is a visiting instructor in U.S. history at Texas Southern University. She has an MA in history from the University of Houston with a minor in world history, as well as a graduate certificate in African American studies. Ms. Meeks is also a published author with two very interesting articles that I really want to read. They include We've Come This Far by Faith, Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, which was published in the summer of 2011 in Houston History Magazine, and Freedmanstown, Texas, a lesson in the failure of historic preservation, also in Houston History Magazine from the winter of 2011. Ms. Meeks has received numerous awards, including Dr. Rod Page Faculty Staff Award from Texas Southern University in 2019, as well as Outstanding Contingent Faculty Member at Texas Southern University in 2017 and 2018. Ms. Meeks has been involved in several public presentations of history, dealing in particular with African American history in Houston. Please help me welcome Ms. Meeks as she enlightens us to today's SWATH topic of voting rights in Texas. Dr. Kossie? I yield the floor back.
We will hear from Dr. Pitre.
Thank you, Dr. Kossie. It is a pleasure for me to make a brief presentation on the history of voter suppression here in Texas. Du Bois said that the past is the present, that without the past, without what was, nothing is. So I have decided to give a brief remark on my book, Too Many Dangerous Towers and Snares, the Black Leadership of Texas, because it has relevance to what is happening today concerning voting rights. Now the question becomes, why did I write this book? I wrote it for a number of reasons, but among those reasons were two myths that I wanted to refute. And one was that Blacks contributed nothing to Reconstruction of those Black legislatures. And I'm sure those of you who are teachers, when you get to that area of Reconstruction, in many of your history textbooks, it's somewhat glossed over. But we had 39 Blacks who sat in the Texas legislature and in the Texas House and 4 in the Senate. So I wanted to find out what contribution did they make to the state. I wanted also to refute the myth which said that these Blacks, since they were recently freed from slaves, that they were simply ex-slaves who had descended straight from the cornfield to the legislative hall. And by so doing, I wanted to point out what Blacks were doing for themselves as opposed to what was being done by and for them. But as I looked at this research, what I discovered that most of those Blacks, and rightly so, was concerned with the right to vote. Remember, it is the vote that would propel them into power. All of them would agree with Darlene Clark Hine, even though she wrote her book 100 years after they served in the legislature. She argued that the vote has been the most effective prize means by which Americans have made their will felt for the Black man, and should I say for the Black woman. It has meant much more. through the exercise of the franchise, they could make that political will felt and protect their physical being and their basic human and civil rights. To be without the ballot was and is catastrophic. Blacks realized this as soon as they were freed and as soon as the Reconstruction Act of 1867 declared the Texas law that had them enslaved unconstitutional. So when Blacks went to serve as constitutional delegate when the Constitution of 1869 was drafted, a newspaper here in Texas, in Houston, the Houston Telegraph, told Blacks, don't go out and vote. So one of the delegates, Charles Bryant from Harris County, said that if a free man can live so well in a free society without having a voice in his government, why not try it yourself? Other Blacks who sat in the legislature also voiced their concern with the right to vote, one of which was George T. Ruby, who is probably one of the most prominent Black legislature senators to serve during that period of 1870 to 1898. And he said that no one should prevent a qualified voter from the free exercise of the elective franchise by bribery, violence, or otherwise. Another Black, this time, by that time, they're going to the legislature. Another Black was Matthew Gaines. Matthew Gaines, by far, was the most vigilant guardian of Black right to sit in the legislature from 1870 to 1898. He was concerned with education, with prison reform, with you name it. But his pet peeve was the right to vote. Texas was the only one that did not send, during the period of Reconstruction, a Blacks to the United States Congress. They had an opportunity to do so in 1870 if they would pool their, if they would vote in a block. So Matthew Gaines chastised his constituents by saying, look around you and see what great power you possess. Shall we turn the meal forever and have someone else eat the meal? He said, we're willing to give whites in proportion to their votes, but so long as we cast 19 out of 20 votes, we can't let them have all the pay in office. Now, let me give you just a brief chronology of what was happening during this time. Blacks of Texas, like those in most southern states, did not take an active role in politics until the passage of the Reconstruction Act of 1867. These acts, which declared the previous action of the state null and void and called for the drafting of the Constitution, made it possible for Blacks to become actors rather than simply objects in Texas politics. So in keeping with this, Blacks went to the poll on February 10, 1868, and cast over 35,000 votes in favor of the Constitutional Convention. There's some problem with can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Blacks went to the poll in February 10, 1868, and cast over 30,000 votes in favor of the Constitutional Convention. And to many white natives, event in the Lone Star State clashed sharply with their fond remembrance of people they thought they knew best, being unable to explain, to understand the politicalization of the ex-slave. Many whites conjured up powerful and tenacious images of them, saying that Blacks were simply a poor, ignorant ex-slave who had ascended straight from the cornfield to the legislative hall. We know that this is not true. Contrary to those contemporary accounts, those Blacks who served in the Constitutional Convention comported themselves very well and introduced measures that benefited all Texans as well as African Americans. For example, Charles Bryant, the one that I just mentioned, introduced a bill to make slave children legitimate upon the marriage of their parents. And this bill was incorporated into Article 12, Section 27 of the 1869 Constitution. Likewise, B.F. Williams introduced a resolution regulating the practice of medicine, saying that no one should practice medicine unless they first obtain a diploma from a medical school or certificate from a medical board. I could go on and on talking about what Blacks did in the Constitutional Convention, but let's turn our attention to the legislature. After The election held on November 30th, 1869, after the drafting of the Constitution, made it possible for Blacks to hold office in Texas history for the first time. Whites not yet recovered from having Blacks help them draft the Constitution now had to turn their attention to the legislature, where 12 Blacks were elected to the House and 2 to the Senate. What seemed, whites seemed not to with the fact that Blacks would be in the minority in both houses, but what they was concerned with the false perception that the bottom rail had reached the top. To be sure, the bottom rail had not reached the top, but it had moved up, and being Black among white, it was hardly visible. When those Blacks first arrived in Austin, they were political novices. They had no training on the job. They had to learn political, non-political institution prior to coming to this. But they were quick learners, and they expressed a desire early to determine the direction of the state. Although they were concerned with public school education, the protection of the ballot, they were also concerned with other issues like mental asylum, prison reform, and a number of others. And this continued through post-Reconstruction. My contention, and so I can give you a few bills that were passed by these Blacks who served that time. Already told you the one by Charles Bryant. Then there's the education bill that was going to lead to the establishment of both Prairie View and Texas A&M. Matthew Gaines, as I indicated to you before, was instrumental in helping Texas get the Morrill Land Act that would allow a state to establish land grant colleges. And as a result of his effort, Texas A&M is now erecting a statue in honor of Matthew Gaines. This would also lead to Texas Prairie View University, along with another Black legislator, William Holland. And of course, there was also the establishment of Deaf and Dumb Institute. But we can say that they supported a number of forward-thinking bills, such as universal suffrage and public accommodation, but they were stymied along the way in many of the other bills that they had. My contention is that these Blacks who served in the legislature did not accomplish all they could for a number of reasons. One, they were in the minority. Two, because of violence and economic coercion. Too many white Democrats who had fought to protect and perpetuate slavery during the antebellum days and who had refused to enfranchise Blacks after emancipation. The election of Blacks to office was a pain in the neck, and in order to alleviate this pain, they resorted to violence. How many Blacks were beaten, flogged, or murdered, either for voting or running for office, may never be known. In order to get a picture of the dangers that Blacks encountered because of their political activities, one has but to look at scores of affidavits during Reconstruction. For example, a Black man from Red River County testified that he was stopped en route to his home by 4 white men after registering to vote. He was shown a heavy rope and told that it would be used to hang him if he failed to vote in the Democratic election. These affidavits are only mild cases of violence. Violence, the victim of the most violent crime left no affidavits, only homicide statistic. Now, if Black voters, if violence were perpetrated against Black voters, it did not escape Black legislators. For example, in 1867, en route to a convention, Stephen Curtis said that he went on because of threat against his life. Matthew Gaines wrote the governor saying, "Write me as soon as you can and let me know what to do. Some white people in this county," that's Washington County, has said that I will not get back to Austin. They say before I get back, they will see me in hell. The Klan was a bit more serious with Goldstein Dupree. He was killed by them. 2 other Blacks legislators were shot by a judge in Hearns, Texas, in the 1880s. But Blacks still persevered and were determined that their votes would not be diluted. but whites were equally determined that they should. Therefore, what did whites do to restrict Black voting? The first thing they did was to establish a white man's party in counties that had a 50+ Black population. One was Harrison County that had 70% Black population. And they stipulated that no colored voters should be allowed to vote in primary election unless a judge had positive information that the applicant had heretofore voted in the Democratic Party. Well, we know Blacks weren't voting the Democratic Party. In Harrison County, also the editor of the newspaper said that by stuffing box, playing tricks on Blacks, and particularly by force, the radical wing of the party had been overthrown. Blacks had been eliminated. One of the tricks that they played on Blacks was to change the colored ballot. They used to have a colored ballot so that Blacks could identify the Republican Party. But once they changed it, many Blacks voted unbeknowingly for the Democratic Party. And it should be noted that in all cases where a white primary was established, Blacks were never sent to the legislature again. So they also used gerrymandering. And the Panola Watchman said that gerrymandering was used to disenfranchise Blacks by indirection. And of course, you know, the literacy test and a number of other mechanisms that they use, but Blacks persevere. And so we can say in general that despite their minority status, despite the fact that Texas was run by a frontier system of justice, where lawlessness was a way of life, that these Blacks did make a credible record. And as I've said, that through many dangers, tall and snares, they have already come. Thank you. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Okay.
Thank you.
So much, Dr. Pitre. Dr. Kossie?
No, go ahead. I'm just, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just saying thank you.
Okay.
So
Okay.
basically what we learned from Dr. Pitre's presentation is that the struggle continues. Tomiko, you can go ahead and present.
Okay, thank you. I didn't know if I needed to wait or anything like that. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And it is an honor and a privilege to be here to talk about voting and what that means in the Black community. I would say it was an arduous task to try to follow behind Dr. Pitre, but I will definitely do my best. I want to talk about why the Texas legislature is moving to fix a problem that does not exist. And so in doing that, looking at Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 3, and just sort of work through what those bills do. And then also in counter to Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 3, look at what the Black Caucus is doing in terms of trying to turn those bills around. All right, and so I just want to walk through Senate Bill 1 and look at what the restrictions are that they're laying out. And so, for example, there's a ban. They placed a ban 24-hour and drive-through voting, which is something that we saw, and I feel like it really worked, especially during the pandemic when it was kind of scary trying to navigate voting with the pandemic raging on. And there's also new voter ID requirements for voting by mail. There's an increase, and this is something that I think really, really stands out, the criminalization of people in Senate Bill 1, because there is an increase in criminal penalties for election workers if they do not adhere to these strict regulations that are being laid out in the Senate bill. And then there's also the expansion, right, of the authority of poll watchers. And that's very problematic, especially given the way that poll watchers sort of navigate that space in polling places. And when we look at House Bill 3, right, House Bill 3 pretty much does the exact same thing. There are some little nuances, I would say, in House Bill 3, especially around early voting and what early voting will look like. So, for example, there's the across the board ban of 24-hour early voting, but the House is looking to sort of expand the time period from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. And the Senate wants to reduce that time and it be from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. And then again, the House bill is looking at a ban on the distribution of mail-in ballot applications and new ID requirements for voting by mail. So meaning that you have to have your driver's license, or if you don't have your driver's license, you know, you would have to give the last 4 digits of your social security number. And then the correction, there's this sort of clause in there about the correction process for mail-in ballots. And then another portion that's really concerning is this monthly check-in on citizenship status, where they want to look at the roles like every month. And this was problematic in 2019 when they did that. And so now here we are again, 2021 with this new bill. And this is something that they want to, you know, re-implement. And then there are some other provisions, like there's the Crystal Mason provision. And I'm sure everyone remembers Crystal Mason was arrested and jailed because she said that she was not aware that her previous conviction prohibited her from voting. And then again, in House Bill 3, there's also that enhancement of poll watcher protection, which in both the Senate bill and in the House bill, it gives poll workers a lot of autonomy and a lot of power, even more power. So even more power, I would say, than the election judges, and they can walk around freely. And that's very intimidating to someone who is trying to vote. I think about my daughter who voted for the very first time in the 2020 election and how she would have felt if she had, you know, someone who was hovering around her and circling around her and watching every move that she was making in terms of voting. And again, this sort of criminalization that is being placed on people who are working the polls. And I think about also my grandmother. My grandmother has been a poll worker for years. And I think about what that would mean for her if she did something, you know, thinking that she was helping somebody, only to then turn around and be punished for that, have a fine placed on her and possibly be arrested and convicted. And so this is very troubling because it sort of is putting people who want to help voters against the voters. And it's, in my estimation, this is a very slick way that the Republicans are trying to, as Senator Carol Alvarado said, implement Jim Crow 2.0. And it's kind of like the Constitution. Slavery is never mentioned in the Constitution. Race is never mentioned in either one of these bills, but it's very clear, right, that the bills sort of target Black and Brown communities. They also target people who have disabilities. And so this is something, Dr. Kossie asked me a question earlier about, you know, what I felt the connection was between Senate Bill 1, House Bill 3, and House Bill 3979. And I think that this is just more of an attempt to try to silence what we do in the classroom, what we're teaching in the classroom, and not have an informed populace. And that's troublesome to me. right? But in listening to what Dr. Pitre said, and one of the things that she said is that Blacks were seen as a pain in the neck, right, for Democrats, and you have all of these attempts to try to thwart voting and political participation by African Americans. And so I was thinking, so this is what we're looking at today, right? We're looking at Senate Bill 1, House Bill 3, and it seems as if Black and brown people are still a pain in the neck now of the Republican Party, right? And that the House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 3, it's sort of this a leave, just to use a modern day term, this medication, if you will, that will serve to get rid of this pain in the neck that African peoples and brown peoples pose to the Republican Party. And so when you think about, again, something else that Dr. Pitre said, like what Black people were doing to try to thwart these attempts of the Democratic Party, I think we have to look then at what the Texas Legislative Black Caucus is doing. They came out immediately, right, against Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 3 and put into effect the Barbara Jordan Fair Elections Act. And that was filed shortly after Senate Bill 1. And so that's Senate Bill 61. And again, that's in opposition to Senate Bill 1. And some of the things that Senate Bill 61 does, it's going to expand voter registration to try to meet the needs, right, of the growing Texas population. And they're also looking at automatic and online voter registration, which I know the Republicans are like, mm-mm. Especially because they want you to like give up your whole life history in order to register to vote. They're also looking at reforming the voting by mail eligibility to allow more Texans to safely and conveniently cast their ballot. And I feel like this is so vital. Like we have to keep up with the changing times. And when we look at what happened to the world during COVID-19, lots of things went digital. Why is it that voting cannot go digital, go online, if you have all of the appropriate safety measures in place? Senate Bill 61 is also looking to increase access to the polls for people who work, shift workers, and for single parents who would, have to find childcare for their children to be able to go and vote, right? And they're doing this by trying to incentivize voting locations and promoting also weekend voting. And then they want to expand access to the ballot box through the expansion of early voting. And they want to modernize, again, this modernization of the election process to, like I said, meet the needs of the 21st century. But what House Bill 1 and House Bill 3 and Senate Bill 1 are doing, it's like going backwards. We're going backwards in time to, this period during Reconstruction and after, where Black people were being disfranchised from the political process, and that's worrisome. But in addition to Senate Bill 61, you also have other Democrats who have put out individual bills, like Senator Carol Alvarado, Eckhart, Hinojosa, Menendez, Representative Miles, Royce West, and Zaffarini. They've all put out some additional bills that, again, are in opposition to Senate Bill 1. I think that's all I want to talk about. I think that opening it up for questions, I think we could dig deeper into what Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 3, what it means for Black and brown people.
Thank you, Tomiko.
Mhm.
One of the things that concerned me as an educator is the emphasis on civic education and how there's a desire on the part of those who are writing these newer laws to keep students from actually being engaged in civic activity. There are also efforts that will undermine funding sources that may be willing to provide teachers with materials that they need. And so that was one of the things that stood out for me as someone who has been reaching out as a college professor directly to people who are in secondary ed. So it was immediately concerning to me when it appeared that it might be more difficult for me to do activities like what we are doing with SWATH, where we're communicating directly with K through 12 teachers, K through 16. The other part that's really interesting to me as well, when we talk about what we're doing to educate our students, it's like we would be really keeping them completely in the dark if we were to try to follow what's written in these newer pieces of legislation in terms of how they impact what we do in the classroom when it comes not only to our state history, but also to political engagement, or even teaching them about civic engagement, really. And so I can't see where any of this is going to help us to create young citizens who are engaged and understand what's going on in the world around them.
For me, I think that I feel like it's an opportunity, right? I don't want to, and it's hard to not think about all of the ways in which it really hurts our students. It hurts the populace. But if there is a way for us to really turn this into learning opportunities and get our students, right, more engaged. So if that means that we do more panel discussions, like this, then I feel like that's what we have to do, because my fear is I've had students, when I start talking about voting and the importance of voting and the history of voting, and they're like, I don't want to hear it. My vote doesn't matter. And to me, that's indicative of what you're saying. And it also shows that, it's not being taught in a way that's impactful necessarily K through 12. And so I'm hopeful that people will look at what's happening in the Senate and look at what's happening in the House and really try to work to turn things around. And I think about the organizations that I'm a part of. I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta, and I know that many of our members went to Austin, right? So, yeah,
I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, but I recall, just as we all do, that moment where we saw George Floyd lying face down on the ground, and we saw him take his last breath. When you look at these different pieces of legislation and you use that metaphorically to talk about what would ultimately happen if all of these pieces of legislation passed, it really is leading toward a kind of intellectual suffocation.
Yeah.
And so what my concern is that sometimes people, when we're confronted with something that's visual, that's easily digested, we see it, we react. You see the marches in the street and all of that. But what's happening here is it's even more awful, because it's actually impacting millions of lives, thousands of educators who are just trying to do their jobs.
Right.
And I do know that right now, as we speak, there is a march that is happening. In fact, I had spoken with Nelva before I knew when they were going to schedule the march. I was personally going to try to go, but they actually started, they're going to be walking every day of SWATH, right? But it's important for us to understand how really that we're talking about a kind of one of the words, an expression that Collette Bloom used yesterday. She called it educational violence. You know, and so when we talk about withholding information, the kind that helps students to understand who they are, to understand their place in the world, and to imagine recreating the world they live in, making it better, they have to have historical context,
Right.
to be able to do that. So
Yes.
I'm really grateful that we're having the conversation.
Mhm.
There are some questions on the side that I see. Nelva, you can go through those with the audience,
Okay.
please.
Sure. And I was going to mention just before the questions, as you had just now, that there is the march that's going on to Austin, from Georgetown to Austin. I did see it very briefly mentioned on the media. And as Professor Meeks just mentioned, if these things are not out there, as you just mentioned, Dr. Chernyshev, if these things are not out there in the media, how are people going to know? It's almost as if they are happening in a vacuum, but they have such an impact on so many people. In the chat, we have a couple of questions, I think from Professor Pruitt. I'm not sure if your question was answered, but it says, what suggestions do you have to make Texans more aware of your work? I'm guessing maybe toward Meeks and Dr. Pitre, and the need to press forward to retain voting rights. And are you surprised by voting suppression that is now taking place? And then I do have a question that is particular for Dr. Pitre. So either one of you want to address that? Are you surprised that these voter suppression bills are coming out at this particular time?
No, I'm not surprised that it's coming out at this particular time. If you look at the demographic in this country, America is becoming browner. And I think it is a fear on the part of the majority that someone is taking their place. And while we should be concerned with having more Blacks voting, or more minority, or more people voting, that fear that they will take their places is causing those individuals to conjure up all kinds of issues about fraud and what have you. So I think it's a matter of power and privilege, that you take in their place, that will remove their power and their privilege. What you said? What the other question? Maybe you can go on.
I agree with
Go ahead,
Dr.
Meeks.
I agree with Dr. Pitre in what she's saying. And, you know, in all of the conversation about voter fraud, it was never proven. Like, where was it? Where did it happen? And no one still has told us where voter fraud has happened. And Dr. Pitre is absolutely correct. This is about privilege. It is about people believing that power is going to be taken away from them. It is irrational fear. And you know, it's fear mongering. And especially when so many people rely on like fast news, fast facts that are not really facts to try to get them, you know, through their lives. We have to do more as academicians. And I would say, some people would probably say, oh, that's not our job, but I believe that it is our job. Like, we are educating future leaders. And so we have to be vigilant in what we're doing. I know some of the things that I do in class. When you think about, Dr. Pruitt asked the question, like, how do you get this information out there? I have my students watching different types of news cycles so that they can understand, you know, you cannot just rely right, on Fox News to be the entity that tells you what's going on because it's skewed. Everybody's view is skewed, but so that you become a critical thinker about what is going on, you have to consume various types of information. You have to read, and you have to read between the lines. And just like I believe that the wording is very slick in the Senate bills, I believe that the wording is very slick with House Bill 3979 and the way that they've crafted it to not come right out and say, you know, yeah, like we're targeting this group, or you have to fill it in and understand exactly what is being said. And with the Senate bill, like I said, the piece that concerns me is this criminalization that we are seeing, and who is going to be affected? It is going to be Black and brown people, right? So yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to try to think about. It's a lot to try to consume and then try to figure out, right? How do we get this information out there? How do we give it to our students in a way that they can digest and then sort of empower them to be able to do something about it?
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
Empowerment looks different. You know, I always tell my students, I'm not ever saying to you, go out into the streets and burn stuff down. No, like empowerment comes from what you know how to do. You have to use your skill set. If you're a musician, I don't know, maybe you write a protest song about it, right? If you're an author, you're writing, like you have to use the skill set that you have to be able to work towards fighting off these things.
Yes. Thank you so much to both of you. And Dr. Pitre, there is a question that is particular to your field of expertise dealing with Black women and the vote. I'm just going to read it verbatim from Hank. If you're, I would be interested if Dr. Pitre could speak toward Black women being granted the right to vote via the 19th Amendment, then voting in 1920, only to have that vote taken away by the white primary system that was established in 1923. Was there thought among Blacks against the white primary in 1923 to protect women having just gained that right to franchise? Do you know of any actions?
No, let me say that for African Americans, until almost the civil rights movement, race was always more important than gender. That Blacks were being discriminated against because they were Black, and secondly, because they were women. Women would, Black and white women would discriminate for against voting. After the Civil War, we today idealize the founders of the women rights movement, but they were opposed to Black men voting while white women could not vote. So African Americans saw the vote as something collective to the race, and therefore they supported the 15th Amendment, even though it entitled only Black men to vote. When we got to the 19th Amendment, it did not have anything about race, and Black women were allowed to vote. Black women in Houston did run for office, but 2 years afterward, the state of Texas passed the white Democratic primary, which said that only white men could vote in the primary. That is, it was discriminatory in terms of race and gender. Again, Black women would coalesce with Black men to have this law declared unconstitutional. It would be a Black woman, Lula Bell Madison White, who would take the lead in having, at least she would pick up the baton and cross it, the line, because Black men and the NAACP had already been fighting for 22 years, but in the latter years, it would be Lula White. they did not protest the fact that blacks won, because once the white Democratic primary was declared unconstitutional, the 19th Amendment still stood, and therefore black women could vote once the Supreme Court declared the white primary unconstitutional in Smith v. Allwright, 1944. So you did not have a protest of black women not voting. And as I said before, for black women coming up in the era of Jim Crow, race was always more important than gender.
Thank you so much for that. That was very enlightening, very enlightening. We have another question here. It's actually a series of questions. What is the best way to mobilize Blacks and Browns around the issue of voting suppression? Many argue that Republicans have instigated these ploys to hold on to power since the demographics are shifting. Can this rationale be disingenuous? I feel that we kind of touched upon that. And let's see. Dr. Pitre was wondering if politicians truly want to thwart Brown and Black success. In other words, is this the true reason for these horrible actions? Is the excuse that Republicans must do this is this the excuse that Republicans are using to retain power?
Yes, yes, I definitely think it's about power and privilege. That is, I mean, even after the Civil War, there was always the question of whether the former slave and former slave master could coexist on the same plane. Then you had Jim Crow, where blacks were supposedly put in their place. And now, I guess to some people, blacks are out of place. There's one historian said that particularly in the South was looked upon as an organic whole where everybody has a place and a function, and African-American place was at the bottom. Now that African-American have reached the top, or not reached the top, but on the same plane, I think it is about, at least in their mind, squeezing them out. They're not looking at diversity. The diversity makes the country better. They're not viewing it, they're looking at it as their place. And that African, or minorities rather, not African American, but minorities are pushing them out of their place.
Okay, your thoughts, Professor Meeks?
She must be stepped back.
I put myself on mute. I agree, and you know, and it's a shame, really, in many ways, that we're in the 21st century, and these are some of the same exact tactics that were used at the turn of the 20th century, right? And yeah, I do wholeheartedly. I don't think it's disingenuous. I think it's the fact. Right, it's very clear that the demographics in the nation are changing. They have been changing consistently and upwardly in terms of there being more Black and Brown people. And whenever it seems that whenever there is like this outgrowth of Black and Brown success, you always have something that's stepping in to try to dismantle that. And we can look at that not just in terms of politics, but look at what's happening with Black and Brown people and the police. Look at what's happening with, and this is so sickening to me, with people videotaping attacks on Black people for like silly, what I would say is like silly little stuff. So yeah, like I don't know. It's just troubling that we have not, as a nation, come to a place where we can coexist with each other. Like it still very much feels like this issue of coming off the plantation and can Black and white people exist in the same spheres? Are you serious? Right? So, and then in thinking about what Dr. Pruitt said, is it an excuse that the Republicans must do this to retain power? Why do you need to retain power? Why is that necessary? Like Dr. Pitre said, like the world is better when there are diverse views, right? Time is out, it's over for this sort of singular way of thinking that is really keeping the US kind of in this struggle, in this hold, and we can't move past it. We can't move past it.
Oh, thank you so much. That was also very thought-provoking, very thought-provoking. I do have a shout out to you, Dr. Pitre, from Hank. He says he loves your book, The Struggle Against Jim Crow, on Lulu Bell White and the NAACP. He is here in our chat. And just another question, and I would post this for Dr. Chernyshev or anyone who is on the panel here, of suggestions that you might have. It would be good for more scholars of color could come together to fight both voter suppression and the attack on critical race theory. What suggestions do you have that could bring scholars of color together around this issue? And also Dr. Pruitt did post some other information on a webinar for Annette Gordon-Reed, who is speaking next weekend. So if you're on the chat still, please look at, if you're interested in her work on Juneteenth, the Zoom link is there. And her work, of course, dovetails with the work of Dr. Pitre and also what Miss Professor Meeks has brought out today. Do you have any suggestions on how to build a coalition among academics?
Well, I'll say that I have been trying through SWATH to bring educators together, particularly those who are interested in African American Texas history. So it appeared to me that this was a great moment to invite scholars to begin to talk even more, and particularly given that we have something current that we can actually speak to. So it's this great moment where the past meets the present. And so I think we're in, those of us who are dedicated to understanding the past, we're in a really good position to help people understand these new pieces of legislation. So even just those of you who have access to the SWATH website, please share it with others. Of course, there are other groups out there, but I just wanted to make sure that since we are in Texas, and I'm a professor at Texas Southern University. I also happen to be a native Texan, and I've been working at Texas Southern University for about 26 years. It just, there was no way. I told Nelva we had to say something. So just bringing everyone together to talk about the laws, I think is a very important first step. There will be more, of course, that we can do. We did get some practical advice from our two speakers yesterday, and I will make those, I'll make all of the videos available on the SWATH website. So just know that we are committed to intellectual engagement and also to making sure that what we do has very practical application. So I hope I'm doing my part.
You are. I would also like to add that at Texas Southern, we also have, I would say pretty regularly, different types of panel discussions, and we have been actively working to invite the community, and I'm sure that we can definitely work to add in scholars from, other scholars into the conversation, because in that space, not only would you, have academicians, but you also have students who very much need to be a part of the conversation so that they can also see, right, and understand what's going on, and also look at these practical applications.
Right.
Yes, and I will definitely volunteer to be a conduit to the K-12 community in Houston. I would really love to be part of these panel discussions, not to be on the panel, but to be aware of the discussions, to add that to what we need to know for as K-12 educators. To be in the room is important.
I would also like to say that the panels are very good. And in addition to that, I would like to impress upon the teachers to do more reading so that they can impart this knowledge to the student. That if you look at when you had the debate between Du Bois and
Booker T. Washington.
Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee was not supposed to be teaching liberal arts education, but if you went to Tuskegee, you got one because the teachers were creative after having learned different things. They didn't teach just home economics and agriculture. They thought other things too. I'm not saying for you to lose your job, but you be creative in the way you
Right.
impart that knowledge to the students.
Yes.
I love one of the suggestions that both presenters made yesterday. Go to the documents that does require reading. But I also mentioned at TSU we actually have the Texas slave trade papers. They still need to be transcribed, but I have been gradually transcribing some, and sometimes I'll use it as an exercise in my classroom so that students can see this was, we're looking at a court case where this person is complaining that the slave they bought is not prepared to do hard labor, right? So, there are different things that we can do in a creative way to help them see and understand what was going on during the time. We are now at 4:02. I want to respect everyone's time. I want to thank you for coming out. I'm just going to share my screen just to remind us again of where we're headed. I want to thank our speakers today. Dr. Darlene Pitre and Tomiko Meeks. I want to thank our moderator for the great job that she's done. And tomorrow we have a wonderful panel. We have special guests, Dr. Darlene Breaux from TABSA, which stands for Texas Association of Black School Educators. She works on the policy wing of that organization. She's also vice president of A-Leaf School Board and chair of the policy committee there. We also have Dr. James Douglas, distinguished professor of law at Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University. Dr. Douglas has worn many hats at Texas Southern, including president of the institution. And we also have my colleague, Dr. Jessie Esparza, professor of history at Texas Southern University. So we do have, I'll serve as the moderator on that day, but we look forward to a really good engagement. Most of the discussion will be about House Bill 3979. So I want to thank you again for coming to our event today. And I want you to invite you back tomorrow. We look forward to a wonderfully engaging event tomorrow as well. So thank you very much for attending.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kossie.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye.
Pitre,
Doc, thank you.
Pitre, and Professor
Thank you.
Meeks.
Ms.
Thank you.
Williamson, thank you.
Thank you.